The ANZAC violin. It was just a cheap violin, and I wanted prize in the shipboard raffle. The year was 1915, and the troop shop was packed with young men from New Zealand. They were on their way to fight the Great War in Europe. This violence no use to me. This violence no use to me. Struck the winner. I can't play a note. He turned to a former Otago schoolmate. Hey, Alec, you're good at music. You might as well have it.
Keep going.
Alexander,
Mm.
8. Ken hesitated. I'd like to take it, but I haven't been learning the violin for long. His Dundee mates laughed. Knowing you, one session is your youth need. Alexander had been a top student at school, and was well known for his amazing memory. The voyage on the crowded ship was long and uncomfortable. To help pass the time, Alexander practiced playing the violin. The music brought back happy memories of family gatherings around the piano. At last, the ship reached Cairo in Egypt, and the men were glad to spend time on shore. Some of them would gather around Alexander's tent in the evening, listen to the music. Play our favorite, someone would call, and once again the strains of Homoscue would drift across the desert. When the order came to shift camp and move closer to the battle zone in Turkey, Alexander was faced with a dilemma. He knew the army regulations were strict. Excess baggage must be left behind. But he had already begun to print place names inside the lining of the violin case. He had recorded places they had passed through, from the Indian Ocean to Cairo. Now what lies ahead for us? Alexander wondered, how many more places will we get to see? He decided he would play music for as long as he could. It was nearly midnight when they anchored off ANZAC Cove. There was stars, but no moon. The jagged ridge of the Gallipoli Peninsula loomed dark above them. Machine guns rattled in the distance. Silently, the troops climbed down steep ladders onto the boats that would ferry them to shore. Enemy bullets splashed into the sea around the overloaded boats, weighed down by the heavy pack on his back. Alexander still managed to hold the violin case in one hand. When they reached land, British troops helped put the men up onto the pier. Go blimey! Go blimey! Go blimey! One of them exclaimed when he saw what Alexander was holding. In the dangerous days that followed, the soldiers had to clamber under gunfire up steep slopes of crumbling clay. They struggled through thorny scrub. Many times Alexander felt like throwing the violin into the gully, but always a grimy hand would reach out and one of his mates would say, "Pass it here, Corber. I'll carry it for you." The men fought their way up the ridge towards the top of Chinook Bear. When Australian stretcher bearer saw the violin, he offered to store it in his dugout. "It might be safer in there," he said. After weeks of heavy fighting, Alexander finally managed to return to the dugout. It was abandoned. The stretcher bearer was gone, his fate unknown. But just as Alexander turned to leave, he glimpsed something in a far corner. Reaching into the darkness, he discovered the violin in its case, partially covered by wrecked blankets. Christmas approached, and the soldiers huddled, frostbitten and exhausted in the dugouts. However, when Alexander softly played the first note, they could ignore for a while and the sound of gunfire and their fears for the future. Forming their thoughts returned to summer picnics and good times at home. Late one night, after playing the violin, Alexander was creeping back to his dugout when he had a feeling of imminent danger. He froze. Bullets skimmed past his body. Had he moved his arm a fraction, the violin case would have been shattered. One step forward, and he would have been killed. Not long afterwards, the soldiers received a sudden order to return to the beaches. Alexander had to leave the violin behind. Reluctantly, he scribbled a hasty note, asking another soldier to try to look after it if you can. When the last of the battered troops were being evacuated from Gallipoli, an Australian officer happened to see the violin. The soldier carrying it held his breath. Would he be ordered to toss it into the sea? To his astonishment, the officer muttered, "Shove it in with my stuff. Some chaps get attached to these things." And the violin was written to Alexander. He printed 3 more place names inside the violin case. "This could be the last," he said, having heard about fires fighting on the battlefields of Europe. Sometime later, the soldiers were sent to the battlefields. They found the trenches were waterlogged and offered little protection from enemy fire. Once again, Alexander had to leave the violin. This time he entrusted it to some nursing sisters in a hospice a short distance from the front line. When he eventually returned to collect the violin, he was surprised to find it in better condition than he had left it, as well as nursing the wounded. "I think someone has been keeping this violin in tune," tune, he exclaimed. The long word in the old stone hospice echoed to the sister's favorite melody, which he played as a gesture of thanks and farewell. Before returning to the battlefront, Alexander managed to borrow a bicycle and pedaled to a music shop in a nearby village. He knocked on the door. No one answered. No one answered. Just as he was about to leave empty-handed, the elderly owners peered through a crack in the door. They expected to see soldiers with guns. Instead, they were astonished to find a young soldier from the other side of the world, wanting to replace one violin, bow, and set of strings. They did all they could to help him, and they never forget their kindness. Alexander had been put in command of a company of soldiers, knowing heavy fighting lay ahead. Knowing heavy fighting lay ahead. He gave the violin to one of his men based at the camp. He felt it would be the last time he saw it, as he and his comrades marched towards the battlefields of the some in France. While leading his men into battle, Alexander was caught in enemy crossfire. Wounded, he collapsed into a muddy shell hole. Bullets hissed around him. For hours he lay in great pain, waiting for nightfall. If he moved in daylight, he would be killed. In the chaos, he was unsure of his position. He taught his men to recognize the stars in case they needed them for guidance. Now, using the polar star for direction, Alexander managed to crawl from shell hole to shell hole, and finally to a trench out of range of enemy gunfire. Amidst the mud and mayhem, a doctor treated his wounds as best he could. But Alexander had been seriously injured. His days on the battlefront were over. He later wrote in his diary, "Then stretchers and ambulance and hospital train took me far away from the guns which I never heard again in the Great War." Gradually, Alexander recovered from his injuries. When he was well enough to travel, he returned home on a hospital ship to Dundee. He went back to university to study mathematics, as he struggled to forget his memories of war. He sought solace in music and the company of friends. Then, one day in 1918, a large package arrived at his home. It had been sent by one of the men he had fought alongside in the war. When Alexander unwrapped the package, there was the violin, carefully restored by famous music from in London. His friends, half a world away, had kept watch over the treasured violin, remembering the man and the music that had lightened their spirits during those dark days of war. Alexander Aitken later gifted the violin to his old school. He wrote, "It will outlive me. It will outlive me. But it will be a reminder who see of the service and sacrifice of New Zealanders in the first World War.